Hey guys, tonight we wander into the moonlit gardens of Versailles, where water once danced to the whims of kings and arguments about symmetry could ripple through entire dinner parties. You pad softly through gravel pathways, the air cool and perfumed with trimmed orange trees and newly damp grass. The stars barely compete with the golden glow spilling from the palace windows. But it's not the stars or chandeliers that draw you forward. It's the hush of fountains, long silenced, but still whispering their stories if you're quiet enough. You pass one now, a wide, low pool shaped like a giant caterfoil, ringed with mythological figures frozen mid-motion. A centaur reaches for a horn. A cherub cradles a fish. The fountain's basin gleams with old rainwater, black and still in the night. But you can almost hear what it used to sound like. High, hissing jets, low bubbling at the edges, a grand splash designed not to refresh, but to impress. Versailles at night is a different kingdom. Gone are the crowds, the tour guides, the selfie sticks. What remains is the eerie, theatrical quiet of a place that once ran on performance. You imagine Louis XIV stepping out in slippers, inspecting each water display like a general reviewing his troops. Because make no mistake, these fountains were his soldiers. Each angle, each spray, each drop was designed for effect. The Sun King didn't just sit on a throne. He ruled the weather, or at least pretended to. The gardens were laid out with such geometric precision that even the water had to march in lines. If it deviated, if a jet arced slightly too far left or fell too soon, someone's job, and possibly head, could be in danger. You think you're exaggerating? One underperforming grotto nearly cost a noble his place at court. Yes, over a puddle. Historians still argue whether Louis believed in the symbolic power of water more than its aesthetic function. Some say he saw himself as a new Apollo, god of the sun, yes, but also of civilization, order, and water choreography. It sounds ridiculous until you see how much ink was spilled over the proper height of a fountain jet. Not gallons. Ink. Pamphlets, poems, engravings, all debating which angle was nobler, which spray more divine. You slow your walk as you approach the Latona fountain. It's the one with the frogs. Well, technically peasants who mocked Latona, then were cursed into frogs. The water's still now, but once it erupted in layers, from frogs to turtles to swans to gods. It told a story in water, and if it didn't tell it clearly enough, well, the aristocrats argued until it did. Funny thing is, you wouldn't survive 2 minutes in this garden back then. Not because it's dangerous, because it's exhausting. Every pebble had political meaning. Every hedge had hierarchy. Even the way water flowed, or didn't, was a conversation about power. And here you are, just trying to fall asleep. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'd love to know where you're listening from, so drop your location and the time down in the comments. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You keep walking. You continue deeper into the gardens, the moon shifting position just slightly, casting longer shadows across the clipped lawns. Behind you, the palace still looms, massive, ornate, and oddly fragile in its grandeur. But ahead, something new takes shape. A massive waterwork, known in its time as the Grand Jet, stretches before you like a watery exclamation point. This wasn't just a fountain. This was Louis XIV's ego, liquefied and launched skyward at 35 meters. Or at least, that was the goal. You stand at the edge, peering into the basin. There's no water leaping now, but the basin's floor still curves like the bowl of a golden chalice. Imagine the noise it made. A roar of ascending pressure, jets thundering into the sky like they were trying to impress the heavens. Because, honestly, that was the point. Louis wanted water to behave like a courtier, disciplined, obedient, dramatic only on cue. The Garden of Versailles wasn't built for peace. It was built for domination, of nature, of nobility, of optics, and especially of water. The Sun King himself would sometimes arrive in a golden boat, rowed across artificial canals by powdered men in silk stockings. He'd gesture to the horizon, and water would rise. Quite literally. Entire sections of the garden were designed to come alive only as he approached. A foot too early, and the water lay still. A foot too late, and the spell broke. But here's the kicker. They didn't have enough water. Not nearly. Versailles sat on dry, stubborn land. To make these fountains work, engineers created an absurd network of pumps, aqueducts, and even a contraption called the machine de Marly, which historians still argue was the most ambitious hydraulic engineering feat of its time, or just a royal money pit. The machine, which pulled water from the Seine over 10 miles away, was so enormous it groaned like a dying whale and needed constant repairs. But that didn't matter. Louis wanted the illusion, the splash, the control, so they built it. Still, the water wasn't enough to run all the fountains at once. So here's a quirky little fact you wouldn't expect. Hidden attendants followed the king on his strolls, turning fountains on just before he reached them and off as soon as he passed. A traveling wave of liquid performance, choreographed to perfection, or attempted perfection, because the truth is, some days the fountains didn't work. The pressure dipped, the jets drooped, water dribbled instead of soaring, and court gossip erupted like a faulty valve. Who had failed? Was it sabotage, or just gravity refusing to bow? You walk past the spot where courtiers once stood whispering about failed displays, their voices laced with vinegar. They'd lean on marble balustrades, watching water trickle, then turn to each other and say, "Well, that was disappointing." And just like that, reputations leaked away. Because when your king declares himself the sun, your fountains had better rise like dawn. You meander now toward a quieter corner of the garden, where the symmetry softens and the hedges form small alcoves. These are spaces for conversation, or more accurately, for gossip disguised as philosophy. A place where poets, priests, and the occasional botanist would gather under lemon trees and debate the proper emotional effect of flowing water. Yes, really. You slip past a marble bench, its seat worn smooth by centuries of powdered bottoms. The air here feels stiller, heavier, like it's holding its breath, waiting for someone to say something outrageous about metaphors again. Because in these very spots, royal gardeners once found themselves under siege, not by weeds or aphids, but by poetry. You see, the nobles didn't just want fountains to work. They wanted them to mean something. Every splash had to symbolize a virtue. Every stream had to narrate an epic. And that's where the trouble began. Poor André Le Notre, the man responsible for Versailles landscape grandeur, famously disliked frilly symbolism. He was a geometry man. Clean lines, crisp hedges, mathematically perfect pools. But court poets had other ideas. They believed a garden should reflect the emotional arc of the human soul. It should move you, tell a story, maybe even make you weep. So you ended up with heated arguments over whether a fountain should evoke joy, melancholy, or celestial longing. Le Notre just wanted it to not leak. One scholar notes a bizarre incident where a royal advisor insisted that the small jets around a particular statue should resemble the tears of a forsaken goddess. The engineer replied, "Yes, but the tears are clogging the pipes." This did not go over well. Historians still debate how much artistic pressure the gardeners endured versus how much they simply ignored. Some accounts describe desperate landscapers sneaking into the gardens at dawn, rearranging statues to better align with sunrise, just to satisfy some dreamy metaphor no one would remember by lunch. Others claim they simply nodded, said, "Yes, very moving," and then did exactly what the pipes allowed. And the poems, oh, the poems. You find one carved delicately into a plinth nearby, where Neptune's breath inspires the spray. The soul ascends in light array. It goes on. You stop reading. The rhyme scheme is deeply questionable. But to the court, these flourishes weren't optional. They were currency. If your fountain told a story, preferably with tragic gods and moral lessons, you earned applause. And applause, in Versailles, translated to power. Water wasn't just decoration. It was diplomacy. It was propaganda. You look around now and imagine gardeners tiptoeing through topiary, trying not to upset the poet who insisted that the West Canal's curve echo the parabola of despair. Imagine trying to bend water to match emotion. It's no wonder half of them had nervous breakdowns. One even fled court, allegedly mumbling about drowning in allegory. You suspect he meant it both literally and figuratively. As you drift farther along the path, your ears catch something impossible, a snippet of argument from long ago. Raised voices, elegant but absurd, rising over the gurgle of a now dry pond. You smile, ah yes. This must be the scene of the infamous mermaid dispute. At first glance, the fountain seems innocent enough. A low marble basin, delicate carvings of coral and seaweed, and at its center, 3 half-nude mermaids poised around a trident. But these weren't just decorations. Oh no, these were the battleground for one of the most ridiculous fights in the history of French landscaping. Picture it. 2 dukes, both absurdly rich, both hungry for court favor, both convinced their understanding of aquatic femininity was superior. The argument? The direction in which the mermaids should spout water. One duke insisted the water should arc high, straight into the air, symbolizing ambition, purity, and, apparently, good moral character. The other argued for a more diagonal spurt, graceful and gentle, like a sigh on a summer breeze. He claimed it was more feminine. A third courtier, clearly looking to stir the pot, suggested a sideways gush, one that rippled across the pool like flotation incarnate. It escalated. Letters were written. Artists were commissioned. Even philosophers were consulted. Seriously. Descartes' name came up, though it's unclear if anyone involved had read more than a line of him. The argument went on for months, and in the end, the mermaids were altered so many times that the original sculpture cracked. The water pressure had been adjusted back and forth, so often that the plumbing behind the marble burst. One mermaid's head popped off entirely. Scandalous. You can still see the scene where they tried to reattach it. Historians still argue whether this quarrel was genuinely about aesthetics, or if it was just an elaborate form of aristocratic one-upmanship. One theory claims that whoever got their preferred design installed would earn a subtle edge in court politics. Another theory says they were just bored and very, very rich. But perhaps the best part? The fountain in question was located in a minor garden, only rarely visited by the king. All that effort, and he may never have even noticed. You stand there now, imagining the tiny tantrums, the dramatic sighs, the dramatic flipping of lace cuffs. A man in embroidered silk yelling, "But it must curve. Water should suggest." Another clenching his fists, roaring, "You clearly don't understand hydrodynamic virtue." And somewhere nearby, a poor gardener probably crouched behind a bush, praying no one asked him to tilt another mermaid. Even the sculptors got involved. One wrote bitterly in a letter that never has Neptune's realm known such indecision, and referred to his final design as compromise incarnate. He was later commissioned to design a grotto shaped like a clamshell and promptly retired. You shake your head, amused. All this drama, over the angle of splash. You continue along the gravel, your steps muffled now by moss creeping in from the edges. An invader no one quite managed to banish, even in an empire of gardeners. The path leads to a quiet clearing, where a strange tension lingers in the air. This is where style met science, and the engineers nearly lost their minds. Here, the feud wasn't over dolphins or mermaids, but something far more sinister: pressure. Specifically, the kind of pressure that builds behind royal expectations. You're standing in front of a now silent masterpiece called the Cascade de l'Encelade. It once featured layered jets of water rising like a staircase into the sky, each tier meant to symbolize conquest, clarity, and whatever allegory the poets were pushing that week. But the engineers knew something the nobles didn't. Water doesn't care about symbolism. It cares about gravity. And so began a silent war. The artists and courtiers envisioned water dancing like silk in the wind, curling at just the right moment, lingering in midair like a note of harp music. The engineers, meanwhile, were frantically crunching numbers, gritting their teeth, and trying not to scream every time someone said, "Make it look more divine." One historical account tells of an engineer named Bellador who stormed out of a planning meeting muttering, "It's a pipe, not a poet." He was later coaxed back with wine and a promise that no one would mention the metaphysical shape of droplets again. Still, compromises had to be made. Pumps were rigged under great strain, channels dug deeper, tanks installed at higher altitudes, all to give the water enough headroom, literally, to perform the elegant arcs demanded by royal fantasy. But those machines groaned. Pipes burst. Valves jammed. Every malfunction was treated like an act of sabotage, even though most were the fault of friction or rust or just plain overuse. During a particularly disastrous display, one fountain misfired and soaked the Duke of Maine's powdered wig. He claimed treachery. An investigation followed. Nothing was found, except a severely corroded copper valve and a note in an engineer's ledger reading, "They want miracles. I have mud." Historians still argue whether these failures were more theatrical than technical. Perhaps the engineers occasionally let things fail just to remind the nobles that they weren't, in fact, gods. A quiet rebellion, hidden in the plumbing. And here's your quirky tidbit. Versailles employed full-time water whisperers, individuals trained not only in mechanical maintenance, but in the gentle art of interpreting fountain behavior as omens. Yes, there were men whose job was to watch the fountains and suggest whether a hiccup meant bad weather or bad favor from the king. You stand now beside one of the very pipes. It's exposed, rusted, its bronze casing eaten away by centuries of stubborn moss. But if you press your ear to it, as one visitor reportedly did in the 1750s, you can almost hear the pressure building. Not just water, but the weight of ambition, art, and hydraulics under a crown-shaped thumb. Now, the path veers into a part of the gardens most visitors never notice. It's tucked behind a marble colonnade, shielded by hedges so finely clipped they look fake, like green fabric pinned into position. But this was once one of the most carefully examined corners of Versailles. Not for its beauty, but for its ratios. You're now standing before what looks like a simple rectangular pond, flanked by statues of dryads and river gods. But don't let the stillness fool you. This pool was a battlefield of invisible geometry. Because for the aristocrats of Louis XIV's court, water wasn't just for spectacle. It was for math. This particular pond was designed to obey perfect proportions, the golden ratio, to be precise. A divine symmetry whispered into existence by ancient thinkers and revived in full Baroque pomp. Historians still argue whether this pond was built with the exact dimensions of 1 minute and 1.618 seconds, but nobles certainly believed it was. They even used it as a reference point for their own designs. You can almost hear them now, pacing its length, murmuring, "Yes, but if your cascade is 5 cubits too long, it loses all poetic tension," or a 47-degree arc. Barbaric. These weren't just water displays. They were arguments in 3 dimensions, executed in marble and moss. It gets quirkier. Several noblemen actually carried miniature measuring rods, little ivory rulers, so they could measure the angle of water jets and compare them to their estate fountains back home. One visitor from Burgundy wrote in a letter that he wept openly at the sight of a ripple that reflected the perfect equilibrium of heaven and earth. His cousin later reported that the man had merely tripped and fallen into the pool, but the sentiment remains. The obsession reached absurd levels. Engineers began designing nozzles that could produce mathematically predictable arcs, jets that would rise, twist, and fall in precise parabolic motion. They experimented with hidden valves and pressure tweaks, all to achieve what one duke called the most honest splash in Europe. Meanwhile, courtiers whispered behind fans about who had unbalanced water, or an arc that sagged in the wrong quadrant. Insults were coded but vicious. Calling someone's fountain impetuous was the watery equivalent of a slap. And let's not forget the ripple debates. Yes, ripple debates. Some believed water should flow in concentric rings. Others preferred asymmetrical undulations to mirror life's turbulence. There was even a faction that claimed water should show no ripple at all, just calm reflection. That group didn't last long. Too boring. But the most sacred principle, alignment. Fountains had to point towards celestial objects, line up with solstice shadows, and frame views of the palace at just the right moment of daybreak. If they didn't, they were labeled disharmonious, which, in court terms, was just shy of treason. And yet, it's peaceful here now. No arguments, no rulers, just the soft moonlight drifting across the water, making everything, even the madness, seem gentle. You wander along a narrower path now, the crunch of gravel underfoot muffled by thick hedges that bow in toward one another, forming a sort of whispering tunnel. The scent of lavender hangs in the air, and somewhere ahead, you hear a soft splash, the memory of a disastrous garden party playing itself out again. You arrive at a modest-looking fountain. Just a single basin with a central spout. Nothing grand, nothing mythological. But the tension it once held could rival a court trial. This is where a minor baron, his name was Henri de Montclair, learned just how cruel Versailles could be when water decided not to cooperate. The occasion was a midsummer fete, one of those lavish, days-long affairs where nobles paraded their gardens like trophy rooms and hoped the king might wander past and nod approvingly. Baron Montclair had spared no expense. He had imported marble, commissioned a local sculptor to carve nymphs, each supposedly based on one of his mistresses, and hired a hydraulic engineer who claimed to be descended from Archimedes. Big promises, big pressure, and then nothing. As the guests strolled through his estate, parasols fluttering, laughter rising like songbirds, the fountain sputtered. A weak burble, then silence. The centerpiece of the baron's entire show stood still, the only movement coming from a lone fly skimming the surface of stagnant water. There are letters describing the moment. One courtier claimed she felt secondhand embarrassment so intense it nearly curdled the wine. Another joked that the fountain was symbolic of Montclair's entire lineage, full of promise, ultimately damp. The damage wasn't just emotional. In Versailles, appearances were currency. A failed fountain meant you'd lost control of your estate, your reputation, perhaps even your loyalty to the king. Some whispered sabotage. Others blamed the engineer. The baron blamed humidity. No one believed him. Historians still argue whether this event was exaggerated in the court gossip network, or whether Montclair truly fell from favor because of it. What's certain is that he was never invited to plan another fete, and his name soon stopped appearing in royal appointment lists. And a quirky detail: weeks after the incident, Montclair reportedly disguised himself as a gardener and crept into the royal gardens to study how the palace fountains were maintained. He was caught poking around a valve near the Latona fountain, wearing a sun hat much too large for his head. When confronted, he claimed he was searching for inspiration. He was escorted out politely and never seen at court again. You stand there now, looking into the same fountain basin. There's moss at the bottom. A single leaf floats across the surface. Still no water. It's almost poetic. This monument to hubris and hydraulics, forgotten and perfectly quiet. You crouch and touch the rim. It's cool to the fingertips. No trace remains of the panic, the sweat, the flushed faces. Just stone, still and unmoved. And in that silence, you hear it again, the slow trickle of power draining away. The air shifts slightly as you leave Montclair's failed fountain behind, and your path opens into a shaded courtyard where ivy creeps up stone columns, and the breeze carries a faint, sour scent. You wrinkle your nose. Ah, mold. A quiet plague that no amount of marble or powdered perfume could completely mask. Welcome to the damp underside of aristocratic ambition, the war against algae. This courtyard was once home to the Fountain of Echoes, a lesser-known but much-visited installation famed for its acoustics. When water poured through its hidden channels and splashed into a central bowl, it supposedly whispered back your thoughts in the voice of fate. Naturally, nobles loved it. It was like spiritual therapy, but with better upholstery. But what the poets forgot, and what the engineers loathed, was that constant dampness and still water meant one thing: mold. Green, creeping, furry, relentless mold. It began on the edges, just a light film, easily scrubbed. Then it darkened, thickened, slipped into joints between marble slabs. From there, it bloomed into full botanical insurrection. Moss-coated cherubs' faces. Algae slithered into basins. One noblewoman reportedly fainted upon seeing mildew growing on a dolphin's snout. Scandalous. The statue is weeping rot, she declared, before being carried off in a lavender-scented chaise. And the water, oh, the shame of drip. No longer did jets arc gracefully. Instead, they sputtered and leaked, forming awkward dribbles that produced unfortunate, rude noises. At one soiree, the Duke of Anjou's fountain released such a sound that guests believed someone had, well, made a noise one doesn't typically make in a ballroom. A violinist dropped his bow. 3 ladies collapsed into hysterics. Historians still argue whether the decline in Versailles fountains during the late 17th century was due to budget constraints, general wear, or simply the inability of high art to defeat humidity. Likely a mix of all three. But what's certain is that no one wanted to admit their garden was going swampy. Thus began a trend of dry fountains. Fountains deliberately kept waterless and framed instead with clever poetry or sculptures suggesting water might appear sometime soon. It didn't, but the implication was fashionable. One plaque read, "In stillness lies reflection," as if mildew were a philosophical choice. A quirky tidbit. There was a brief, highly confidential movement among courtiers to install vinegar misters, small copper nozzles hidden among statuary that would spray a vinegar solution to discourage moss. The results were mixed. It worked, but the smell? Imagine rotting lemons and wet wigs. The king reportedly commented, "It smells like ambition gone sour." You kneel now beside one of these ancient basins. Its interior is slick with moss, and you find yourself wondering how many arguments were held over whether it should be cleaned, replaced, or poetically rebranded. You can imagine a courtier waving a hand dramatically, saying, "The green symbolizes eternity." You suspect it just symbolized laziness. Still, in the quiet, with the ivy swaying and the breeze playing across the stones, the mold feels almost restful, soft, patient, outlasting ambition. You now find yourself wandering toward a quieter section of the gardens, where the foliage is oddly pristine and the marble practically gleams. It feels staged, like a set of waiting actors. And it was, because this is where one of the more absurd chapters in fountain history unfolded. The duel over the dolphin. Yes, a duel. Not with swords, though it nearly got there, but with snide remarks, veiled insults, and artistic tantrums that could curdle cream. At the center of it all was a dolphin statue. Specifically, the dolphin perched atop the fountain of marine harmony. It was meant to symbolize France's naval strength, or the nobility's connection to ancient sea gods, or something vaguely aquatic and flattering. The exact allegory changed depending on which poet you asked. But one detail no one could agree on: the dolphin's expression. You walk around it now. The sculpture is masterful, elegant, and yes, ambiguous. The dolphin's eyes are half-lidded, its mouth slightly open. It could be smiling, or sneering, or suffering indigestion. And that mystery, it drove two powerful aristocrats to the brink of madness. The first, the Marquis de Lestre, claimed the dolphin should display serenity, symbolizing calm leadership and benevolent monarchy. "The waters of France," he proclaimed, "flow from wisdom, not from teeth." The second, the Count de Charbon, found that interpretation infantile. He demanded a more dynamic dolphin, fierce, determined, a warrior of the sea. Let it bear teeth, show strength, he barked during a particularly dramatic garden luncheon. What began as a disagreement turned into public rivalry. Pamphlets were distributed with illustrations. Artists were paid to sculpt correct versions of the dolphin, some serene, others bearing fangs like aquatic lions. Satirical plays appeared at private salons. One featured two dolphins arguing over who best served the Sun King, while a third dolphin, weeping dramatically, declared all fountain art dead. Historians still debate whether the dolphin's original expression was even intentional. Some believe the sculptor had grown tired by the time he reached the mouth. Others suggest it was designed to be unreadable on purpose, to invite court debate and distraction. After all, nothing occupies the aristocracy like interpreting a creature that cannot defend itself. You bend now, looking closely at the statue. The marble is pitted from centuries of rain. Lichen hugs its fins. The face, well, it still looks ambiguous. Maybe that's the point. The quirky detail? The sculptor who designed this dolphin eventually fled court after a failed attempt to redesign at midnight. He was caught with chisels under his cloak and muttering, "I'll make it smile properly this time." He vanished from records shortly after, though rumors claim he later worked on fountains in Vienna, ones filled only with turtles. Back in Versailles, the feud cooled only after the king, reportedly bored of the entire episode, declared, "Let the dolphin feel what it feels. We are not all obliged to smile." You straighten up. The dolphin stares back. Is it laughing? You'll never know. But it held more political weight than most people ever will. The air grows cooler as you follow the curve of a moonlit hedge, the gravel path tightening into a narrow corridor that leads to the backside of the gardens, a place where visitors rarely wandered. This is where the real secrets were kept, not in scrolls or vaults, but in blueprints, bronze valves, and locked doors beneath the fountains themselves. Because beneath all that elegance, Versailles pulsed with something murkier. Espionage. Yes, welcome to the underworld of hydraulic sabotage, where rivals sent spies, not soldiers. You arrive at a once-sealed maintenance hatch set into the ground, half concealed by a stone planter. Court records called it La Chambre de la Fontaine, but among the gardeners, it had another name, La Trahison Humide, the wet betrayal. It began innocently enough. Nobles would admire one another's fountains at public fetes. A flattering compliment here, a raised eyebrow there. But soon the praise turned into reconnaissance. The shape of the jets, the angle of the nozzles, the peculiar pressure of the third-tier cascade. How did you get it to arc like that? Someone would ask casually, as if they weren't already bribing your estate's plumber behind the hedges. Historians still argue whether these tactics truly classified as espionage. After all, could you steal a water feature? But make no mistake, nobles began hiring garden consultants, who were often just sneaky engineers with photographic memories and loose morals. There was even a case where a fountain technician, Jean-Louis Petitgrain, was accused of moonlighting at rival estates, installing deliberate flaws in their piping systems. The duchess whose garden suffered a sudden dry season claimed he left with a spanner and returned with sin. He denied all accusations, of course, but suspicious clogs seemed to follow him like perfume. The quirkiest incident? A midnight break-in at the Château de Louveciennes. Witnesses claimed they saw a man dressed in all black, except for the very visible white stockings, crawling from a drained fountain with a rolled-up sketch under one arm. When confronted, he claimed he was performing an artistic study of moonlight on limestone. No one believed him. These raids weren't just about aesthetics. Knowing how your rival managed a particular spray pattern or concealed a pump gave you leverage. Court life thrived on subtle superiority, and a better fountain meant a higher perceived intelligence, taste, even divine favor. It was water warfare by another name. And of course, none of this sat well with the royal engineers of Versailles. They began using decoys, false piping layouts etched into marble, misleading valve placements, and even intentionally misaligned spouts. One map showed a non-existent reservoir labeled Source du Génie, the source of genius. It led nowhere. You crouch near one of these old hatches now, brushing away dried leaves. Beneath it lies a maze of bronze and lead, once guarded like military secrets. Pipes that sang when water moved through them, if they weren't tampered with. The moon shines down. The grass is still. But beneath the soil, whole histories of sabotage sleep in silence. The gravel underfoot gives way to smooth stone now, leading you into an open circle framed by obelisks and a single central pool. The pool is shallow, wide, and edged with marble so pale it glows under moonlight. You stop here, not for the view, but because this was the site of a very peculiar debate, one that lasted decades and never truly ended. You kneel by the edge, where the water once sprang in 12 identical arcs from bronze lion heads. This was no accident. Every curve, every distance between jets, was meant to reflect the ideal of symmetry. But here's where things got strange. Someone once asked a dangerous question. What should a perfect splash actually look like? You'd think the answer would be simple. A clean arc, perhaps a satisfying plunk. But not at Versailles. At Versailles, splashes had to mean something. One camp argued the splash should resemble a Roman arch. Strong, controlled, timeless. Another believed it should mimic the rise and fall of a bird in flight. Graceful, fleeting, poetic. A third insisted it be mathematically divine, shaped by the Fibonacci sequence and the precise logic of spirals and sunflower heads. And then, the philosophers got involved. Yes, philosophers. They began writing treatises on what splash patterns best capture the human condition. One claimed the ideal splash had a delayed descent, a moment of midair pause before falling, representing the struggle between ambition and gravity. Another described the ripple effect as the physical echo of one's actions, and claimed any splash that failed to ripple in perfect concentric circles was ethically suspect. Historians still argue whether these philosophical debates were serious or satirical. but there's plenty of evidence that they shaped actual fountain designs. Some nobles commissioned sculptors to tweak the mouths of statues, slightly adjusting angles to produce a more reflective splash. Others changed the depth of their pools to affect resonance. Yes, resonance. Because if a splash sounded too aggressive, it was considered vulgar, too faint, emotionally dishonest. The quirkiest moment of all? A secret nighttime demonstration held by the Comte de Villeneuve, who unveiled a new nozzle design under candlelight. He called it Le Souper de l'âme, the sigh of the soul. The water rose in a thin column, bent slightly midair, and fell with a whisper. Some wept, others clapped. One poet fainted, though that may have been from the wine. You peer into the basin now. No more lions, just their footprints in bronze, worn smooth by centuries of debate. You cup a bit of water in your palm and let it fall back into the pool. It lands with a soft plunk, sending small rings outward. Not concentric, not poetic, just water doing what it does. And still, you can almost hear the courtiers arguing. Too shallow, not spiritual enough. Doesn't remind me of suffering. All this over a splash. It makes you wonder how anything ever got done in a place where even droplets had to prove their moral worth. The garden path dips now into a sunken square framed by trellised vines and lantern posts long extinguished. You find yourself standing at the edge of one of Versailles' most curious and least practical experiments in aquatic design, the musical fountain. Once known as Le Théâtre d'Eau, it was an open-air stage of sculpted jets and synchronized movement, where water was made to dance in rhythm with live musicians. A theatrical idea, born from one noble's desire to combine his two great loves, opera and plumbing. The Marquis de Ferrol, a minor court figure with major aspirations, believed that water could be made to follow melody, not just mechanics. He commissioned a full orchestra pit adjacent to this fountain, complete with a tiny harpsichord platform and concealed conductor's booth. When the orchestra played, hidden fountain valves were to be activated in rhythm, so each spray would perform like an obedient ballerina. Needless to say, it didn't work. At least, not at first. Historians still argue whether the idea was ever technically possible with 17th century plumbing. While simple jets could be timed with rudimentary levers, real precision, true synchronicity between flute and fountain remained elusive. One soprano later wrote that the fountains refused to keep tempo and claimed she was once nearly upstaged by a rogue jet that splashed her mid-aria. But the project carried on. Why? Because failure at Versailles didn't always mean abandonment. Sometimes it meant doubling down. Ferrol kept modifying the system, even inviting engineers from Italy and the Low Countries, promising glory to anyone who could make a trumpet solo trigger a water arc. One quirky anecdote tells of a gardener who tried to mimic this effect by simply standing behind the fountain and opening valves manually, watching the conductor and raising a flag for each musical cue. For one glorious afternoon, it worked, until a misread signal led to an unexpected burst that soaked the entire string section. Applause followed, but not for the music. Still, the musical fountain became popular for what it represented, not what it delivered. The dream that art, nature, and human invention could be braided into a single performance. Guests stood around in powdered wigs, whispering in awe, even as the water sputtered out of sync. Over time, the music was removed, and the jets returned to their regular rhythm. But the fountain's shape remained unusual, layered terraces with narrow channels, like a tiered wedding cake left in the rain. You glance at it now. Moss fills the grooves. A few leftover carvings of lyres and masks peek through the overgrowth. If you listen hard, you can almost hear a harpsichord note caught in the breeze, hopeful, slightly off-key. And the Marquis de Ferrol? He died still convinced his greatest performance was yet to come. His final wish was for a memorial fountain in his name, one that would play his favorite aria every June. No one built it, but this sunken stage remains, quietly offbeat, defiantly romantic. The path curls sharply now, leading you through a grove of chestnut trees whose branches creak softly overhead. The leaves shimmer faintly in the moonlight, and as you step into the next clearing, you're greeted not by splendor, but by simplicity. A low stone trough, a modest trickle of water, and a statue of a child pouring endlessly from a jug. This is the fountain of innocence, And it was scandalous, not for what it showed, but for what it didn't. In an era where Versailles fountains gushed with allegory and ambition, this quiet piece offered no grand mythology, no implied virtue, no elaborate spouts to show off engineering genius. It was just water falling from a tilted jug, a child at play, and some nobles absolutely hated it. They called it rustic, undignified, worse, unpoetic. Where were the gods? The symbols? The moral resonance? One duchess reportedly refused to walk near it, claiming it made her feel like a common milkmaid. Another courtier whispered that it had the smell of modesty, which, in Versailles, was not a compliment. But the fountain had defenders too, mostly younger nobles and visiting artists who saw it as refreshingly honest. They argued that its charm lay in precisely what others found offensive, its lack of pretension. This, one painter wrote, is not about power. It is about the act of pouring. Historians still debate who commissioned the piece. Some claim it was Marie Adelaide of Savoy, a duchess known for her dislike of pomp. Others believe it was a forgotten royal child's gift, offered in innocence and accidentally installed permanently when no one had the heart to remove it. Either way, it stayed, and over time, this little fountain became a quiet icon. Lovers met here. Servants paused to rest. Even the king himself was once seen standing near it alone, hands behind his back, watching the jug's endless pour with what one observer described as a look of bewildered peace. The quirky detail? A secret game emerged among Versailles children. If you caught a single drop from the jug in your palm without it breaking, you could make a wish, but only if you didn't speak the wish aloud. Supposedly, one page boy wished to fly, another to marry a duchess. That second one eventually became a bishop. Go figure. You crouch beside it now, watching the water slide over smooth stone, barely making a sound. There's no pressure here, no politics. Just the child, the jug, the fall. It doesn't try to impress you. It doesn't care what philosophers think. And maybe that's why it lasted. In a palace where everything strained to be extraordinary, this one corner dared to be ordinary. And in doing so, it somehow became timeless. You reach out. A single drop lands in your hand. It stays there, cool and round. You don't make a wish, but it feels like you could. The moon dips lower as you make your way through a corridor of trellised vines, the cool hush of night sinking deeper into your bones. You sense you're approaching the far edge of the gardens now, the forgotten fringe where projects failed, fashions faded, and time reclaimed its territory. This is the graveyard of fountains. That's not its real name, of course. Officially, it was called the Reserve Quarter, a space where unfinished or broken fountains were kept for possible future restoration. But everyone knew it as the place where dreams went to rust. You passed the crumbled remains of a marble dolphin, perhaps cousin to our earlier debater, and then a shattered basin filled not with water, but with dry leaves and dirt. A headless nymph lies sideways beneath a laurel bush. And over there, a stack of decorative urns, their handles long broken off, leaning like tired soldiers against the wall. This is where fountains went when their symbolism lost favor, or when their plumbing proved unworkable, or, more embarrassingly, when they made people laugh for the wrong reasons. Take the infamous Fountain of Heroic Bladders. Yes, that was a real concept. A well-meaning baron attempted to build a fountain symbolizing bodily endurance during wartime. He chose bladders, yes, literal anatomical bladders, as the motif, sculpted in bronze, with spouts. The outcome was unfortunate. It lasted 6 days before being quietly removed under the cover of darkness. You can still see fragments of it here, tucked behind a hedge, vaguely balloon-shaped and deeply unsettling. Historians still argue whether this graveyard was ever meant to be public. Some think it was a secret testing ground, where engineers could experiment with new hydraulic ideas without risking embarrassment. Others believe it was simply a dumping ground for ideas that fell flat with the king. And yet, here's the quirk. The gardeners loved it. While courtiers argued over metaphors and poets debated splash ethics, the gardeners wandered these ruins like archaeologists of failure. They'd sit beside broken statues, sipping wine, swapping tales of overambitious designs and cracked aqueducts. One old maintenance log describes this corner as where reason sleeps and leaks. And sometimes, just sometimes, the gardeners brought pieces back to life. A disused spout became part of a newer installation. A damaged cherub's head was repurposed as a fountainhead on the east lawn. Quiet acts of resurrection. Quiet victories. You kneel now beside a toppled satyr, his grin chipped but still mischievous. His hollow eyes seem to say, "Well, we tried, didn't we?" The silence here isn't heavy. It's gentle. A slow exhale after centuries of too much effort. You run your hand along the cracked edge of a forgotten basin and feel the worn smoothness of time, not failure. Because here, in the place where fountains stop flowing, something else continues. Not water, not prestige, but memory, mischief, and maybe mercy. You rise, letting the moment settle like dew on stone. You've nearly reached the end. The gravel softens in a bare earth now, your footsteps hushed by layers of fallen leaves. The garden is nearly behind you, but not quite. One final path curves to the right, hidden behind a thick curtain of cypress. You push through, and there it is, small, quiet, and flickering faintly in the low light, the King's Fountain. It was never marked on public maps, never included in court tours. And yet this simple installation, tucked far from the golden glory, held more significance than all the others combined. Because it was designed, some say personally requested, by Louis XIV himself. A single column of water, rising from a plain stone spout into a shallow pool, surrounded by nothing but grass. No sculptures, no poetic inscriptions, just water and silence. You walk slowly around it, tracing the edge. It's said that the Sun King would come here alone, late at night, when his court was asleep and the performance of monarchy could pause for a breath. One valet wrote that he saw the king standing at the fountain for hours, hands clasped behind his back, listening, not watching, as the water fell. No performance, no pose, just presence. The design of the fountain itself remains a mystery. Some engineers insisted it was built for acoustics, the trickle tuned to a specific frequency meant to calm the nerves. Others claimed it represented time, how it slips through fingers, ungraspable, constant. Historians still argue whether the king truly found comfort here, or if the legend was built later, romanticized by those who needed to believe their ruler had a soul. The quirky detail? There's a tiny, hidden pipe beneath the fountain, installed just after the king's death. It leads nowhere. Scholars believe it was a symbolic gesture, meant to signify that all power, no matter how strong, eventually leaks away. You sit now on a mossy stone nearby, the last one before the hedges open again toward the palace. The water murmurs beside you, soft and ceaseless. This, you realize, is where the arguments end. The fountains, with all their drama and excess, all their symbolism and sabotage, all their splashes and sputters, none of them truly lasted. But this one, this modest stream, still flows, still speaks. You close your eyes. In the quiet, you can almost hear it all again. The philosophers whispering about the meaning of ripples, the nobles gasping at ill-timed sprays, the engineers sighing into blueprints, and above it all, the endless drip of water, indifferent to titles, unmoved by poetry, and slowly, like a soft curtain falling at the end of a play, everything begins to fade. Let slow now. Let your breathing match the rhythm of the trickle. Let your thoughts dissolve like marble into moss. The garden behind you still hums faintly with memory. Those impossible debates, those swirling splashes, that stubborn mold clinging to elegance. But none of it needs you anymore. Not tonight. The kings, the courtiers, the poets with their fountain metaphors, they've all stepped off the stage. Only the water remains. It doesn't demand your attention. It just flows, the way it always has, beneath hedges and time and footsteps long gone. Steady, small, and sure. You're not walking anymore. You're floating now, gliding along a quiet channel between dreams and stillness. The air grows cooler, softer. A breeze carries the scent of old stone, and a single drop lands on your forehead. Not cold, not wet, just symbolic. You smile. Let your limbs loosen. Let your jaw unclench. Let your thoughts ripple outward, quieter and wider, until even the edges disappear. There's no need to solve the mystery of the fountains. No need to remember the names. Just rest here, at the edge of the water, where ambition has gone silent, and only the earth remains. Sleep is coming, and when it arrives, it will move gently, like a fountain that no longer needs to impress. It will wash over you, not in a grand cascade, but in a whisper. Just a whisper. Good night.